So we'll talk about Toby Chow's TED Talk and then the link to social movement theory. So with Toby Chow's TED Talk, he gives a really useful overview of social movements. He importantly notes that any significant social change that's happened, say in policy, in practice, in people's mindsets, really has happened because of social movements. That people don't change because they should, they change because they have to, right? That in being confronted with an issue, usually typically for a really extended period of time, that they're forced to. That they're forced to kind of confront their views, they're forced to confront policy and change that. And it's the pressure that social movements place on this that makes that change happen. He also touches on the risks to activism and advocacy, that people involved in these movements know that these risks are present and that these risks might come from outside oneself or within one's home or source of identity. And those can be really tricky, the ones that are most tied to somebody's social identity. So for your journal attached to this, I'd like you to think about which risks you might be willing to take and be honest about like what might hold you back, what might be holding you back now, or what might have held you back at some point. And what steps might you take to counteract those risks, or do you feel that the risks are too much? Now, looking at the social movement theory, these try to explain the causes of social movements, why people may become involved, how they might affect change, and what are the consequences of social movements. So it's kind of this interdisciplinary approach to it. And the first few theories that they discuss are older theories. So I'll talk about these, but these are really not in fashion now, because a lot of them looked at social movements and social involvement, especially in protests, as something that was really negative and bad, right? So with collective behavior theory, that posits that people were seeking to assert some sort of control, say in their environment or their lives, that perhaps urbanization and industrialization had created some sort of strain for them. So this is kind of their like bursting out of that. So people reacted in protest, which was seen as negative. And also, like, this really looked at crowds, and it said that being in large crowds inclined people to become violent, and especially because they felt anonymous in a large group, and they acted differently than they would alone. With mass society theory, this came about to try and explain why people may have become involved in fascism and communist movements. And this kind of assumed that isolated people who were isolated socially were more vulnerable to extremism, that they were more vulnerable to these belief systems. And they connected this to individualism, that the waning, like regulating influence and sense of belonging to the community made people feel like they were on their own, and then they became susceptible to this. And relative deprivation, this theory kind of thought that people joined movements because they had a strong sense of inequality or were being deprived of something, of deprivation, that their needs were not being met or they were being denied a basic right. Something was being taken from them, right? So this said that they were acting out because they were trying to correct that. Now, these are old theories. Now, with the newer 60s and the theories like in the 60s, I'd say especially probably 1968, because that was a year of protests worldwide, especially student movement protests. It was a big year in terms of like social movement. So that's when like theorists and society began to have a much more positive view of social movements as kind of a healthy expression, a healthy democratic expression of people's views. So some of the newer theories are kind of more US centered. These are called structural approaches. So here there's One of them is political opportunity, political process. So this is saying when groups see that there is a chance to kind of influence the decision-making process, to become more involved, to be able to participate more directly in that, they'll take that chance, right? So this is saying that these opportunities might come up when maybe there's a conflict between ruling elites, right? So groups of leaders maybe in conflict, and then other social groups can come in and kind of intervene, right? Maybe there might be somebody who's a big political ally with them, and we're going to look at an example of that in a film in a couple weeks. Or like states may be kind of on the decline and less likely to repress dissent, and so these groups, social movement groups, will rise up. Now there's resource mobilization. So resource mobilization is when this population that is becoming mobilized is already really well organized and has a lot of resources. And so they're more likely to create kind of these organized forms of protest and tap into the resources that they already have, right? And so they're using these resources to achieve their goals, which may involve like money, organizations, connections. So here it lists a few. Material being money or physical capital, right? So having the money to put towards a goal. Moral resources, so having solidarity with people, having kind of a growing sense of a movement. And we've seen that, say, this year, like with Black Lives Matter protests or like with women's protests, right? Social organizational, so having really well-defined organizational strategies, good social networks, right? Maybe utilizing those social networks well and being able to recruit a lot of people. Human resources, right? So having people, having volunteers, having people who are willing to kind of work within an organization and lead it. And then cultural resources, cultural like capital. So having people who already have activist experience, people who are well versed in issues, and kind of knowing how to mobilize collective action. So it's using all of these resources. And then there's social movement impact theory. So this looks at the lasting impact of a movement on individuals, institutions, cultures, and political systems. This theory really has examined whether, so this one like hasn't been studied as much as others, but this one I think is interesting because it looks at violence as a method in social movements and whether this is effective or not. So I think that's an interesting thing for us to think about this semester. There's a couple of examples that I'm going to give you, say, even when people were kind of discussing Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., and whether violence or nonviolence is more productive. So it's an interesting ethical question. And then finally, looking at social constructivist approaches. So these are more kind of European-centered and looking at history of social movements in Europe. So say like for Italy, for example, in Italy, protests like have been a big part of their history. And so they were people like working class people, workers really protested quite frequently, dealing with class issues and with labor rights. You know, it was a pretty common thing. And they'd strike maybe for better pay, for better working environment, for rights, benefits, whatever it may have been. And they would just strike a lot. But this says that in this social constructivist approach, more modern protests are centered more on social or political issues rather than specific like worker rights issues. So it's looking at things that concern people about society, right? And it sees protests as kind of a product of one's identity, and that solidarity among larger groups of people has grown as their middle class in Europe has grown. So perhaps it has something to do with identity, that people had more time, more willingness, more ability to become involved in things or to think about these broader identity issues. And then a couple of theorists. So Malucci looked at the formation of collective identities, and that through society, like people were able to kind of come together and join these identities together and then advocate for issues around that. And then Jasper, for whom we'll be reading soon, looked at protests as a form of expression, right? And a way to define morality and moral values. And he connected it a lot to emotion. So we saw it as kind of an expression of the individual in a collective sense. So we'll discuss kind of more of this together, but I wanted to give us a good foundation in terms of how theorists kind of study this before we start looking at real world examples.